Hello and welcome back to A Modern Pharmacist. And in today's episode, I'm going to go through probably one of the most controversial areas of medicine of recent times, and that is peptides. And when I'm talking about peptides, I am talking about specifically the ones that are related to the wellness area and the fact that they are highly unregulated. Because for those who don't know, peptides as a class of treatment have been around for, technically over 100 years. But let's get into it. What is a peptide? So, for those who don't know, proteins and peptides are made up of these little building blocks called amino acids. And when you have more than one amino acid joined to another, you can then create these things called peptides. And usually they will target certain hormone receptors, enzymatic reactions. They can become very good drug targets, hence why we have used them for many years. And a couple of common examples that you may be aware of. So, insulin being one, which was discovered, I think, in the 1920s. We've got GLP-1 agonists, which were used for type 2 diabetes, but now have been licensed for weight loss and have been very, very successful. I am not going to be discussing GLP-1s in this episode because they are going to basically fill their own episode because I feel like there's so much I can talk about when it comes to that one. We've got ones in terms of gonadotropin releasing hormone, where we treat prostate cancers, endometriosis, breast cancer. So there's so many that we can go through. And this podcast is not here to discuss whether they work as a group. They clearly work as a drug target and as a drug combination. It's mainly relating to the fact of should people be using the peptides related to the wellness brand era, whatever you want to call it, because they are highly unregulated. So it's just trying to, make people aware if you are using them, but also from a healthcare point of view, patients are using more and more of these peptides. So we need to know how to look out for certain warning signs and how to monitor their use so that patients get the right advice, essentially. So before we go into it, there's a few things that, and I think this is applicable to any medication. There's a few questions that you should really ask yourself in terms, well, before you start any drug, especially when it's an injectable one, because with peptides, because they are a certain structure, they can be more sensitive to changes in gastric acid or pH. They can be susceptible to enzymes. So you've got gastric lipases, pancreatic enzymes. So there's a lot of things that can affect their absorption when it goes through the gut, hence why they need to be injected. So, and when you do so, it removes the liver from the equation. So essentially, this ingredient is going straight into your body with a lot less protection than normal. So there's a few things that I would normally say to people to be wary of is, does the medication have a viable or defined mechanism? Is there evidence of its use further downstream? So maybe past 1 year of use, is there something where if you intend to use it for 10 years, does it have a 10-year evidence base? Then what do we know about its safety in animals and in humans in general? What is the risk of you taking it versus the benefits of taking it? And in terms of peptides, does it have a legitimate other compound that's been approved, which we will come on to? And the four peptides that I'm going to cover today. So we've got BPC-157, probably the most common peptide and the one that I was first made aware of in terms of this wellness space. Then we have CJC-1295, we have SS31, and the last one was Melanotan-II. And the reason I picked these four is because there's a couple of other medical professionals in America who've also researched these four because these are the ones that they get asked about the most. So I thought, other than GLP-1 pens and agonists, I'm going to go through these four and just give you an idea of what you should be looking out for. And you can sort of take the information from these four peptides and put them across every other potential peptide that you may be considering as a user. And you can also take this information as a prescriber or healthcare professional because you can also sort of understand what is going on here. So BPC 157, body protection compound 157, so has a lot of bold claims. So for those who want to know, it's a 15 amino acid structure, and apparently it was meant to derive from a gastric product. and a gastric hormone that we naturally synthesize, and was found in the 1990s by scientists in Croatia. However, after looking at all the studies, information that's online, there's actually been no homology posted, meaning that there's no one who can find the actual original compound where this was meant to be derived from. And then when you actually look further into it in terms of its bold health claims, which is injury healing, reduced inflammation, gut healing, pain, and even cognitive benefits, there's still no proposed mechanism of action, which obviously starts to bring a lot of doubt into question as to where has this come from? Has it been purely a marketing stunt, or is it just that it's hard to find this information? So looking at a few things, there was a study where it was done in rats, and there was 12 rats, and basically they clamped the hind leg, and in 6 of them they used BPC 157 to see whether they could revascularize the hind limb, and in the other 6 they used saline, and there was meant to be a better blood flow to the ones who were using BPC 157, a 50% improvement in blood flow. And the proposed mechanism for this is something called vascular endothelial growth factor. So it was meant to stimulate that, which hasn't been proven. And if this was the case, then you've got the idea of, if you have too much of this, could this induce tumor growth, which would be a very potential consequence of it. Looking in terms of human studies, again, despite the fact that it's been around for over 30 years, there is no peer-reviewed human randomized controlled trials. And for those who are wondering what is the best form of evidence, a randomized controlled trial is exactly what it is. You get usually 2 treatment groups. You have one where they have the treatment in question, ones that do not have the treatment and it's a placebo. And basically you give them the same environments, the same variables, and assess whether that medication, treatment, whatever it may be, has a positive impact. And you do so in a way where the patient doesn't know which compound they are receiving, so that removes bias. And then you can obviously control it and try and do it over a long period of time with larger numbers of patients, because then that gives you greater representation of what would happen in reality, essentially. So with this one, I couldn't see any peer-reviewed human randomized controlled trials. And then looking into why this is being pushed so much, apparently 80% of the studies have been done from one lab, where the senior author apparently is a part owner of the sole company who are developing it. So again, there's bias within this. And the fact that all of this, when you actually pair it together, that there's no mechanism, we can't find the original compound, there's no human studies or data to any reasonable degree, why people put this in their bodies is beyond me. And this is not to say that this could have a really good beneficial effect. It just goes back to that risk benefit of, why would I inject something into my body where there's no real data around? It's only being done on a few rats, a few petri dishes, and that applies to all medication, even if it's approved. And I was going to come on to this later on, but because something's been approved and potentially is safe in a large amount of people, doesn't mean that's right for you. So one treatment could be male pattern baldness. Now, ideally, I would love my hairline to go back to where it was maybe 10 years ago. And there are licensed and safe, in inverted commas, treatments that we can use. So the brand name being Propecia, which is 1 milligram finasteride. Now, that has been studied in numerous patients. I've given it out numerous times for prostate cancer, even for male pattern baldness. But for me, the actual risk of erectile dysfunction and all the other issues that are related to the male reproductive system is a complete trade-off, and that's not something I'm willing to take just to get my hairline in a better situation than what it is at the moment. So that's approved, it's safe in large numbers, but it still doesn't fit my lifestyle or my risk benefit profile. So hence, going back to this one, BPC 157, it is going to be even lower in my list that I would ever use this, because there is limited data out there and people are quick to just put stuff like this in the body, which is quite scary. So this one is one I would probably disregard. The next one is one called SS31, and this is actually it's got an approved drug on the market for a syndrome called Barth syndrome, which is essentially where you have heart and skeletal muscle issues because it's affecting the mitochondria. And what's happening is on your mitochondria, you have two membranes, two linings, and on the inner membrane, there's this compound called cardiolipin, which can be dysregulated in people who have Barth syndrome. And the consequence of this is that for a lot of people, we are aware that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's where all the energy, or the majority of energy that comes from your food, is made. If you have a dysfunctional membrane, it then stops the production of ATP to its full efficiency, essentially. So, in tissues that require a lot of energy, such as the heart and skeletal muscle, then you can get muscle wastage, which is what essentially Barth syndrome is. And this is where the actual drug, elamipretide, comes from. And the compound that we use in the peptide world or the wellness space is SS31 from that. So in terms of does it have a proposed mechanism, when we go back to the framework that I mentioned earlier on, it does. In terms of its long-term data, it was pushed through and it has been in numerous studies. However, the data comes from these patients who've got Barth syndrome, and they done a 6-minute walk test, I believe, where they assessed how far the patients would get in 6 minutes before the drug and then after taking the drug. And I think the group who weren't taking the drug got 400 meters. When they used ele- elamipretide, they got an extra 90 meters on there. So it did improve their exercise performance. They then did single leg extensions, if I can speak today, and they improved their strength by 50% on the weight that they were moving when on SS31. So there is a proposed mechanism. However, when you actually look for studies in healthy individuals, which is a big thing that you need to take into account here, is that the majority of people who are going on peptides are usually fit and healthy to a large extent. They are either one, looking to further enhance their health, or two, they're not in the best shape. So technically not fit and healthy, but there's no severe past medical history and they're looking for a quick fix. And a lot of the studies that are done in the majority of drugs anyway do not include this group of people. So can you extrapolate the information from this and put it into healthy adults? In my opinion, no. And it's not something that I would advise on anyway. And this has been reflected in terms of even in the heart failure group that they treated it on, is that it didn't improve mitochondrial function, because this was the whole premise behind this, was that if it's improving it in these patients who've got severe mitochondrial deficiency or abnormalities, if we then give it to people who want to enhance their metabolic function and we can improve the mitochondrial health, then that's going to be a really good outcome. However, that wasn't the case and it wasn't seen in this. Just as a quick point as well, why do people go for peptides on the grey market as opposed to this one, for example, where it does have an approved drug by the FDA? The FDA approved drug is $800,000 per year, whereas the peptide grey market version is $10,000 per year. So again, you can see clearly there is a cost difference. And a lot of people are saying that healthcare professionals, the health industry is against peptides because of the lack of financial capitalization from certain pharma companies. And one thing I would like to point out, again, I'm not affiliated with any pharma companies or any national bodies where I would benefit from saying this, but a pharmaceutical company, if they bring out a drug from development, on average, this was going back to university, it used to be about £1 to £3 billion to bring a drug through to market by the time you've gone through all the phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials and once you've formulated the drug. So you want to make a return back on that. And when you are working in healthcare, you can use a drug in two ways: licensed or unlicensed. Licensed means if you get a blood pressure medication and you use it for lowering blood pressure, that is a licensed indication. So that's good. You are protected as a prescriber, you are protected as a patient, and you are protected as a medical providing company, whatever you want to call it. If you use it unlicensed, so an example of this is amitriptyline. A lot of people use it for nerve pain. It's not technically licensed for that. So the prescriber is not covered. The patient is technically not covered. So if anything were to go wrong, the pharma company has specifically stated that it's not used for these reasons, so they would not be able to be sued from that point of view. But if there is an opportunity for a company to use it in multiple indications, so for example, the GLP-1 pens at the moment have been granted a license. I actually need to check this, but I was told by one of the pharmaceutical reps they have been granted a license for post-heart attack recovery, essentially. So not only have they got type 2 diabetes, they have also got weight loss, which was added in, and now they've got post-heart attack recovery. So if you increase the amount of license and agreements, you make more money because more people can use your medication. So when I come onto this later on, you will find that many of these peptides have either come from a dropout from clinical trials or they're just being made not illegally but unregulated in an unregulated environment. So the pharma companies clearly would have capitalized on this. So it's not like we're against them because we're not making money. There's obviously a reason. These companies are multi-billion pound companies for a reason. But yeah, to summarize on SS31, doesn't seem like it does too much if you are technically a healthy adult. So it's one that, again, it's got a viable mechanism, but I would stay away from it for a couple of reasons. Now, the third one is called CJC 1295. Now, this is mimicking growth hormone releasing hormone. So a lot of people may be aware of growth hormone, and essentially growth hormone induces growth of muscles. It induces fat metabolism. So from a metabolic point of view, it's really good, and it does so in a fasted state, which is even more obscene and how good that is. And that is why a lot of people have used it from a bodybuilding point of view, because you can still build obsessive amounts of muscle whilst reducing the amount of energy that you intake. So you're not putting on fat mass. It's unbelievable. However, one thing about growth hormone, which before I come onto this drug, is that it can induce insulin resistance within the periphery. And the reason being is that it's it's doing so to preserve the glucose for the brain. So you can, in some people, get increased glucose within the blood, which then can lead to diabetes in some format, which is why it does come with a few warnings. But CJC1295 mimics the hormone that stimulates the release of growth hormone, which is growth hormone releasing hormone. So it does have a proposed mechanism and actually has been looked into for certain indications. So there is one indication I've been made aware of. So it's HIV lipodystrophy, which is essentially where a lot of the fat is accumulating within visceral places, so around the organs. So when you give growth hormone, releasing hormone, it stimulates the release of growth hormone. And like I said before, it will remove fat from them organs. So metabolically, they are in a better place. In terms of CJC 1295, there was a study, I think, in 2006, where it was like a phase 2 trial, and one of the patients died of a heart attack 3 hours after an 11th dose, I believe. Apparently, that was due to heart disease in general, and it wasn't due to the drug. However, this was when the trial was stopped and abandoned. So, again, this falls into the adverse effects, the human safety data, but it was technically a dropout. So people have seen that it has gone through phase 1 and 2, and then it's dropped out due to potential safety concerns. And then they picked it up and obviously manufactured it for themselves. When it comes to growth hormone, I've never been one to ever jump on the bandwagon of you should use it and enhance it. If you are growth hormone deficient, so you can get dwarfism, or you've got issues like HIV lipodystrophy, then I believe growth hormone is a beneficial form of treatment for you. If you have, however, normal levels of growth hormone, then I don't feel like the net effect would be that beneficial. I feel like you are pushing a needle. You are toying with this idea of having diabetes and also dysregulating an endocrine system that can cause a lot of harm if it goes out of control. So it does have approved mechanisms that was going through phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trials. It is not something that I would advise, but again, a lot of people are using it. Now, the last peptide I'm going to discuss today is Melanotan-II, which was nicknamed the Barbie drug because essentially it works on a hormone pathway which is resembling alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. Now, there are 5 receptors for this pathway, I think receptor 2 we don't use, but receptor 1 causes hyperpigmentation of the skin. Receptor 3 and 4 works within the appetite and libido sort of centers. And that is where the majority of the effects of this drug comes from. So the only issue with it, from what I could see, is that it's not selective. And what that means is when you have a certain drug, you would like it to go to a certain receptor. So in this case, if you wanted to target the hyperpigmentation, you would want it to go to melanocortin receptor 1. However, when you make a certain compound where it can interact with multiple receptors, you don't really have any control on where it's going to go. And for those who don't know, this is how a lot of medication leads to many side effects. So for example, a beta blocker works within the heart on a beta 1 receptor. However, it does also act on beta 2 receptors, which are within your lungs and airways. So that is why people who go on propranolol for anxiety, for example, can feel shortness of breath because their airways will close because the beta blocker will work on the airways at the same time. So that is something that needs to be made aware of when it comes to this medication. Now, before we go on to adverse effects, I would be asking the question as to why you would need to go on this peptide, because the large majority of its use, obviously the Barbie drug being its nickname, is mainly cosmetic. And it would be a case of I would literally do everything else before I would ever need to go on this. And there are better ways to go about why you would need to be on this peptide in the first place. And I've seen many people who've gone on to these tannin peptides, which again, they feel as though it's good and it makes them look healthy. However, they are running themselves a very high risk of melanoma. And then when you come to the fact that it does regulate your appetite at the same time, could you be going into anorexia? There's so many disorders that this could lead to. And again, it's not something I would advise. So just before, as a quick summary, going through all the 4 peptides here, BPC 157, no real mechanism, not something I would be pumping into my body. SS31 does have a mechanism, does have an approved drug. However, unless you have Barth syndrome, doesn't seem to be really that beneficial for you. CJC 1295, related to growth hormone, it's not something I've ever advocated for because I just feel as though there are many complications that could come from stimulating excessive growth. And the fact that cancer always lingers in the back of my mind when you think of really accelerated growth, that is the idea that it can become uncontrolled, and it's something that always doesn't sit well with me. Again, something I wouldn't use. And the last one, Melanotan-II. I mean, if you really want to go and look like Barbie, then I think there's quite a few more issues that you need to address in yourself before pumping yourself with this peptide. These are just 4, and by the looks of it, there are many, many peptides in the pipeline. So I think I heard the figure of 150 are in the latter stages of some sort of research and development. And I think about 750 are in the pipeline to go through like research and development in terms of can they be put into clinical trials or of some form. But like I said at the very beginning, that these peptides come about for a few reasons. They've either become a clinical trial dropout, which, why is that the case? Like I said earlier, pharma companies are very clever when it comes to financial literacy. They are in the top 10 companies. There are a few in the top 10 companies worldwide in terms of wealth. So why would they be leaving something if it was so popular and had a really good efficacy, safety profile? I just don't think they would. So I would always look into why was it a dropout in the first place. Another reason is something called compounding, which is a bit of a gray, well, it's all gray area, but the compounding side of things is a medication is in production right now. So a GLP-1 pen, this was common in America, and then a pharmacy or other agency lab would then formulate a drug that's already in circulation. So technically it's there, it's just doing so in an unregulated way. And then there are obviously compounds that have never been tested at all. They've just got a really good marketing team behind them. BPC 157 seems to be the one that sticks out to me. Really good marketing team. The people who are taking them tend to be in good health anyway because they are trying to induce recovery after really good workouts. So is it actually the compound, or is it because these people are really, really proactive and at the top of the game anyway? A couple of things that I wanted to say before this finishes was I was looking into where do these come from. And apparently, don't quote me on this, a lot of them do come from China, which some of them do actually come from really good labs that pass FDA inspection. And FDA is the Food and Drug Administration, and they are basically the ones who approve medications for use in public in America. So some places probably do have all the things intact, and I don't dispute that some of these compounds will work, like I said earlier. My point is, how confident can you be when a compound that you are injecting into your body is made in a sterile environment, that it is the correct dose that it says on the label, that it hasn't been tampered with outside of the lab? And I think that's a big issue, is that the manufacturing of these medications or peptides in China or wherever is largely not the issue. It's what happens downstream of that. Is it that people are packaging them, interfering with them, changing the composition, changing their stability, affecting the quality? There's so many things that can be done after the point of manufacture that would always make me question, why would you put this into your body? And that's just not about peptides, it's about every medication anyway. Is can a lot of these peptides also are focusing on things where there is a reversible cause, and a lot of it is really a quick fix, in my opinion. I really hope that come across better than what I thought, because I've been putting this off for a while. It's an area that has a lot of eyes on it, but there's not that much data out there that we can really confidently say certain things. And I just feel like people need to be aware of it, and they are not going anywhere anytime soon, because a lot of people are getting perceived benefit from them, and there's only going to be more and more money pumped into this class of therapeutics going into the future, especially the fact that they are used for research use only, which gets them around another legality, which is annoying, because obviously everything that we do is regulated, which puts a lot of breaks in place. And when people are going around giving these compounds, where it can really cause a lot of harm, and then I can't go out and diagnose someone's bloods without putting it on my insurance because of certain legislation. I just find it completely a double standard, where I just think they don't want people in healthcare to really go outside of a system. But if you've got this far, I hope it made sense. It was quite hard to go through it in a logical format. I will probably revisit these. I am definitely doing GLP-1 pens in the near future. This was all for informational purposes only. It's not medical advice. And if there's any comments or concerns, drop them below, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for listening.